it is my prayer that the strength, truth, and grace of our Lord Jesus Christ are never far away as I record this throughout the entire season, because I don't say this lightly when I tell you that every moment of creation so far has been bought with a price. This isn't the easiest thing I've ever done, but it also seems like whatever I'm doing will be of consequence for someone. I hope it will be, but I think it will. I talked last week about American nationalism, that the way forward is American nationalism, that we're going to see more of it as time goes on. And that's true. But I also want to marry that to the idea, an idea which is much older, and that is Christian statescraft. We have 1900 years of tradition of Christian statescraft. It is a craft. We, as Americans, tend to think that the government is a necessary evil, that the cogs of the government are full of wicked men, that government is unfortunately necessary, but it's repulsive, repugnant. And often is the case. The government is only as good as the men within it. But what happens when a government is peopled by men who are virtuous, men who want to see the best for their country, men who can make good decisions in spite of their human nature? The first step towards an American nationalist ideology, the first part of that foundation, means rightly understanding the idea of power. That's what we're going to talk about today on The Jaded Observer. I'm going to start by telling you two stories. The men in these stories are pretty similar. One of them may or may not have existed. The other one is fairly recent. I think we can all agree he existed. The first man is Cincinnatus. In the early days of Rome, when it was still a republic, there was a general named Cincinnatus who, at the end of his decorated career, retired and became a farmer. And as a farmer, Cincinnatus, he was done. He had already done his part, but there came a time when the barbarians were at the gates, and the people of the Republic knew that the Republic was taking too long. It would not be able to repel the threat of the barbarians. And so the people asked Cincinnatus, "Will you be a dictator? Will you take on absolute power? And will you defend us? Because we can't make decisions fast enough. The nature of a republic means that it takes time to make decisions, and there's disagreement. And ultimately, it's not effective enough to meet such a fast-moving and dynamic threat." And so he did. He put down his plow at the edge of his field. He picked up his sword, and he took absolute control of the Republic of Rome. And within 16 days, he completely destroyed their enemies. He routed them. He chased them, destroyed them, and the Republic was saved. And the people obviously were grateful. They asked him to remain dictator for the rest of his life. They were ready to transition into an empire, into a sort of imperium with an emperor. But he said no, and he rejected the power. He put down his sword, and he walked back to his farm and picked up his plow where he had left it, and lived out the rest of his life happy, successful, but most of all, having held power, having been given the opportunity to take power, and choosing instead to let power go. The second man has a very similar story, but instead of being dubiously lost to the annals of history, we know him pretty well. He was recent. George Washington, obviously, was given the opportunity to become king. After leading a bunch of farmers in a revolt against the world power, the greatest power of the time, he was asked to become a monarch. And we hear that story today and we tell ourselves how silly it would have been for him to say yes. But consider the fact that in the 18th century, it was uncommon for a nation not to be a monarchy. In fact, the only republics that had been tried at the time had ended pretty disastrously. The French had a long history of failed republics, founded upon humanist ideals. And the United States wasn't entirely humanist in its foundations, but it was humanist enough that they rejected the notion of a king and instead desired a republic. And Washington, even though he was unilaterally beloved and incredibly successful, and he stood at the far end of a long protracted war, victorious, having defeated the world power, and he chose instead to surrender the idea of kingship, surrender that power, and he elected instead to choose a system, the one that we somewhat follow nowadays. The thing connecting those two stories is the idea that today we think of power as icky. We don't like power. Power is a bad word. And in many cases it is. There are plenty of stories demonstrating that power can be corrupting and it can be evil. But also, power is necessary. Power is the will to govern. And righteous men, or perhaps men who are principled enough, can wield power, not indefinitely perhaps, but long enough to accomplish their task without becoming corrupted by the thing, and still retaining the ability to let it go. Tolkien wrote about this in The Lord of the Rings. The defining moment for Galadriel is that she was given the opportunity to wield the ultimate power in Middle-earth, and instead she chose to reject it, and that was considered her, it venerated her. It allowed her justification, the passage to the West. What Tolkien was writing about there is the very same idea. Power is a tool. Power can be a test, but ultimately power is not evil in itself. So how would a nationalist, American nationalist view of power begin? To start with, let's take a look at current events. The invasion, you could call it, or the fiasco in Venezuela recently, is a good demonstration of nationalist power without too much involvement. When the Trump administration chose to target Maduro, they picked an easy target, one who no one will miss. The only people in Venezuela who miss Maduro are the Venezuelan government officials on his bankroll. They reminded the world that in 8 hours, no matter who you are, we can have a black bag on your head and have you before a judge. They chose a target who had been antagonistic towards the United States. They exercised power on a global scale. But it was different, for example, from the wars in the Middle East. The difference is power, I wrote this down. Power is the ability to influence the course of human events. Quite simply. When you think about power, it is control over life and death. It is the ability to influence the course of human events. And in our policy, we should be influencing human events to the benefit of our people. That is the ultimate aim of government. That is what a government does. A government is created by the people for the benefit of the people, and that doesn't change. Even if it's a democracy, if it's a monarchy, a republic, it is in some way an extension of the people, which should have the sole benefit of its own people in mind. A king, or the idea of monarchy, we think of monarchies now as a king who is disconnected from his people and lives in a nice palace while his serfs are outside toiling. But the idea of monarchy is far older than that. It comes from back when, in Europe, the tribes were essentially families. They were large groups of people related somewhat distantly, but all related by blood. They were all families. They were clans. You can think of it like the Viking clans. And there was one member of that family, usually an elder or someone by bloodline, who was either appointed or rose to the task of leading that people. That's the origins of kingship. So while a king may not be an elected representative of their people, they're still the embodiment of the spirit of their people. And when a king governs, the benefit of the people should be the benefit of the king. Now, obviously, there are despotic kings. You can pull up any examples you like. You can cherry pick from history. But for as many wicked kings as there have been, there are also stories of good kings. The station is not the problem. The character of the person's heart is the problem. And for every wicked king, you can find a wicked democracy, or a group of people who voted themselves into oblivion. But that's aside. That's besides the point. The goal of a government is to influence the course of human events for the benefit of their people. So how is Venezuela different from the Middle East? Well, the government has the prerogative to defend our hemisphere. We face threats from China and from Russia, other hemispheric powers, and they often launch incursions into our own area. The Russians fly bombers over Alaska. The Chinese move drugs and guns through Canada, through Mexico. Mostly drugs, but drugs and criminals, let's say. Venezuela did similarly. They moved MS-13 and drugs through the Caribbean into the United States. And whereas our involvement in the Middle East had the stated purpose of spreading the idea of democracy, what we did in Venezuela was more or less defensive, or at least it had the benefit of securing our influence in the hemisphere. Power is not necessarily evil, and the expression of power on the global stage, the use of force, taking the leader of Venezuela, you could say it is a dangerous move or an aggressive move. But to take a step back, for most of human history, when governments relate to one another, when they interact, they have been outwardly not hostile, but assertive. The idea that governments are all these democracies on the world stage, the United Nations model, that's a pantomime. It's a charade. It came about after World War II. For most of human history up until 1945, governments interacted on the pretext or the pretense that they have their own interests in mind. And everyone understood that. Nowadays, it's no different, but to make it more palatable, to move the media narrative, they have turned nations into caricatures of themselves, and now it's all these personalities performing a charade on the global stage. But as much as you like to believe that Italy is characterized by Italians who lose their mind when you snap spaghetti noodles in half, the government of Italy has its own interests in mind. The government of Denmark has its own interests in mind. There are no peaceful relations between nations. There are only relations which are, for now, better off with peace because of a greater threat. Have Europeans always gotten along? Of course not. The people in Italy don't like the people in Germany. The people in Italy don't like the people in France. Germans don't like the French. The French don't like the English. The Danish don't like most of them. Most of European history has been filled with wars. What unites Europe right now is the threat from Moscow. The United Nations was formed essentially in response to the threat of communism and the aftermath of fascism. But it was founded on the idea that democracy is the highest and best good a nation can achieve, which isn't necessarily true. The nations of the world are very different from one another. Democracy doesn't work in the Middle East. It never has. So when we went to the Middle East to spread democracy, obviously it was bound for failure. And you see that when we left Afghanistan. Within 2 weeks, the entire country had been taken over by the Taliban, who had reinstituted Sharia law, and 2 decades of progress was undone in 2 weeks, because democracy is not a virtue. Democracy is a system, and it is a system that doesn't work. When we bring people from those places into Europe and expect them to abide by different rules, why are we surprised when they don't quite fit in? Assimilation takes time. The point of this long-winded rant is that what we think of now as the relationships between nations is a charade put on for the comfort of the people watching. But the people in government now are sociopathic. They don't care what you think or how you feel. What's convenient for them is that it's more digestible for you. But if you believe that the governments of all these nations of the world are charitable, then you're mistaken. You're fooled. So what does that mean for power? Power is a necessary expression of our self-determination. When people cheer for Ukraine fighting back against Russia, they are cheering for the use of power against another power. But when Russia is aggressive because of the encroachment of NATO, people think of it in terms of like Star Wars, that Russia is the evil empire and Ukraine is the rebels. If the tables were flipped, people would have a different view of it. But more importantly, rather than being concerned for what's happening over there, we should be concerned for what's happening in our hemisphere, where we are concerned, where our well-being is at stake. So when the United States maneuvers to take control of Greenland, or at least to arrange an agreement where we have security control of the Northwest Passage, that is diplomacy in a way. It's heavy-handed. But that view of power says that where American interests are concerned, as long as we're not doing something immoral, like bombing civilians or steamrolling Gaza, our ability to defend ourselves, our ability to pursue self-determination is our priority. So when Denmark chooses not to defend a territory, that becomes our problem. And that is why the United States leveraging its influence and control over Greenland is a move that defends its interests in this hemisphere. It's different from going to the Middle East for democracy, but actually for oil. That's a little bit different. But the nationalist view of power, abroad is a little bit easier to define than at home. While Venezuela and Greenland are good examples of a nationalist expression of power, there are other times where its expression at home is a bit concerning. The Trump administration, in its treatment of American citizens, has been not great with the ICE raids. Now, on the one hand, the illegal immigrants in the United States should be removed because they're criminals. I don't think it's too far out of line to say that illegal immigrants should probably be removed on account of being illegal immigrants. But what's more concerning is the treatment of American citizens in the process. Now, the issue with that woman in her car, the lesbian who was shot 3 times by ICE agents. On the one hand, when you obstruct the federal government in its tasks in such a reckless and belligerent way, you can expect some kind of pushback. But the way that the government, or the way that that particular agent responded, was clearly heavy-handed. And unfortunately, and this is where we get into the disconnect between what we have right now and the ideal of American nationalism. The way we treat our citizens being the key word, is that you're innocent until proven guilty. No one has the right to execute who they believe to be a criminal. A police officer would be trained not to walk in front of that vehicle because you are allowing someone who is clearly belligerent the opportunity to escalate the issue and bring more consequence on themselves, and also putting yourself in harm's way. The ICE agent who walked around the front of the vehicle was also reaching for his weapon before she began driving. So suddenly it's murky. The way that the current administration uses ICE is as sort of as a secret police, but not actually. And we come across that a lot. My concern with the current administration is that it knows there is an appetite for American nationalism, but it does not want to do what is necessary to establish it, and instead it opts for televised Hollywood-style sensationalism. By using executive orders the way it has, which will be undone by the time the next president rolls around. By the way, it has heavily emphasized the FAFO, mess around and find out mentality, the one that boomers really enjoy finding on Facebook. Treating the situation as that woman messed around and she found out is dehumanizing. She was still an American citizen, and American citizens are innocent until proven guilty. By all measures, you should try not to execute American citizens on the street, even if they are obstructing. And again, there's a case to be made for using force, but also there's a case to be made for not hiring every wannabe cowboy and mall cop, giving them a gun and a badge and saying, go out and do this. A lot of people enjoy using the explanation that he was dragged by a car months earlier, which, of course, if a police officer, shot somebody because months earlier he had had a gun pulled on him, obviously that wouldn't work. It's a weak excuse for what could have been the government circling the wagons and saying, that was out of line, we're going to investigate this. But instead, it doubled down because there's an appetite for nationalism, and the government currently sees that as an invitation for televised sensationalism, but not real change. It is a cheap use of power, not a principled use of power. To go back to the idea of Christian statescraft, power is necessary. Power must be used. There are countries that want to destroy us. We must defend our right to self-determination, but we must do it with order, with principle, with virtue. And that means sticking to American and to Christian values. American values like our Christian religion, like the right to self-determination, like the individualism, not the hyper-individualism, but the individualism that made Americans strong and drove them to conquer the frontier. The Constitution, our constitutionality. America has always been a constitutional nation with an emphasis on rights afforded to American citizens. Now, that being in mind, those don't apply to non-citizens. So using constitutional defenses for illegal immigrants, for example, doesn't work. And we need to have a more mindful application of the idea of citizenship, what it means to be a citizen. For too long, it has not meant enough to be an American citizen. For a lot of them, especially the ones born here, me included, there's no price tag on citizenship. There's no cost of entry. It costs nothing, and something that costs nothing is worth very little. It's thrown away. I've come to appreciate the fact that I'm a citizen But most Americans don't think twice about it. It's understood. It's just an intrinsic part of themselves. Being a citizen should mean something. It should have some kind of cost. And that's a topic for another episode, but the United States government should not be ingsoc. We shouldn't go around executing our citizens on the street. But we should also have order and strength. And power is all of those things. So, to summarize, power is a tricky concept. It's a taboo word. The pursuit of power for its own sake is a vice, but the use of power can be a virtue. No one looks to a weak king for leadership. No one wants the powerless to lead them. When people need leadership, when the decisive moment arrives, people look to strong leaders who know how to wield power effectively, with conscience, with order, with strength. That's necessary to lead and guide a nation. Power is essential. Power should not be seen as an inherent evil, but at the same time, the expression of power should be measured with Christian morality. We were and should be a Christian nation. Christian nations for almost 2,000 years, with some failure, but in the large part, had to wield power for their survival. In the Middle Ages, when the Saracens were invading Europe, when Spain was lost, when the Eastern Roman Empire fell, when Constantinople became Istanbul, when the Muslims got as far as Poland, what saved Europe from becoming essentially a caliphate was Christians using power to defend themselves and the truth. I suppose the last part of power is the idea of war. And as a defense for this, when Jesus spoke to the centurion because his servant was sick, he didn't mention at any point that the centurion was at fault or in error or in sin for being a soldier, a career soldier, actually, a well-decorated leader of 100 men. Similarly, when John the Baptist was speaking in Luke 3, and the various groups, the tax collectors, the Pharisees, are all asking him what they should do then to enter the kingdom of heaven, or in the new kingdom. And the soldiers ask, what should we do then? And he says, do not extort, do not use power unjustly. He doesn't tell them that in the new kingdom there should be no soldiers. And Jesus doesn't seem to say that either. He tells them that they should be virtuous, that they should use power, and that they should marry it with virtue and principle. The same is true when Christians go to war. Going to war is an evil. Make no mistake. War is a uniquely evil prospect, and we are told, thou shalt not kill. But, at the same time, God commands the Israelites to go to war when he offers them the promised land. And there's a long diatribe about how that plays out today. But the point there is that war is an evil, but it in itself is not always forbidden. When there's a question of justice, when the weak are at risk, when the invaders are at the doorstep, would you consider someone evil for defending themselves in their home if someone breaks in with the intention to steal, kill, loot, destroy. If someone shot a home invader in self-defense, are they in sin? In the same way, if a nation is under attack and it defends itself, is it in the wrong? Obviously, with all such things, war is murky, and the ramifications are not always clear, but it is not necessarily evil to go to war, for Christians to go to war, for Christians to be soldiers, for Christians to use and wield power, again, not for its own sake, not for the love of power, which would be sin and vice, but for the purpose of either protecting themselves or defending the weak and the innocent, defending their country. The purpose of power is to effectively govern a state. The state must be imbued with power, and Christian principles do not prohibit the use of power, and American nationalism must have a rightly ordered view of power. Power that does not mean unnecessary aggressiveness or conquest for its own sake, like Attila the Hun. But to go into Venezuela and take a dictator who's been sending criminals and drugs here to hurt us, to kill us, to steal from us, to go out and remove that man is not an unnecessary or unauthorized use of power. It's bold. It is a heavy-handed use of power, but it's not wrong. Similarly, to leverage our influence on the global stage to either gain control of Greenland as a territory or to get the people who control it to do so effectively isn't a bad use of power. Going into another country and toppling its government and subjecting its people to a foreign system of government on its face, and really as an excuse to plunder the nation's resources, I could see that being an inappropriate use of power by all means. But those are questions we can answer by marrying power and order and principle. A strong government must use both. I think that's it. With that, we'll talk to you next week.